Sound of Money with Santosh Sirur.
Hello and welcome to another amazing episode of The Sound of Money. And the beauty of this episode is that this is our first episode in season 3. After completing 84 plus episodes, here I am, Santosh Sirur, with a wonderful series of The Sound of Money continuing all through to 2025. And what an amazing day again for me to host Siddharth Shetty. It's a peekaboo into the future, and that's what he's working on with his team. Siddharth is joining me from San Francisco, and he is the co-creator of Finternet. And in fact, he's also the co-founder and the CTO of Sehmati. He's also been the former advisor for the Ministry of Finance on the DPI, and also been the technology advisor for the Foundation for Interoperable Digital Economy. And that's a lot to talk on this podcast. He has been involved in very much in designing the India stack, including the UPI, also the Ayushman Bharat Digital Mission, the Digi Yatra, which is, as most of us know, how seamless it is to crisscross airports in India now. I think that's amazing. And Siddharth has played a very crucial role in that. Also on Digital Sky, which is the drone integration into civil aviation, civil airspace. And of course, he's a passionate conservationist, essentially being from Goa. We'll talk about that all in this first episode of season 3 of The Sound of Money. Hi, Siddharth, and welcome to my podcast, The Sound of Money.
Hey, Santosh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for hosting me. I'm really looking forward to today's session.
Sure. Thanks, Siddharth. My first question is going to be that I'm sure you have answered it a zillion times, but one more time. It's this intriguing word, Finternet. Is that going beyond the internet? I know it's more to do with finance, but can you break this down and double click a bit more on what is Finternet for us?
Yeah, I always love explaining it. So even though it's a gazillion time, it's always fun. The Finternet is really this idea of how do you give individuals like us and businesses control over your own identity, broader credentials you may have attached to your identity, who you are, what you do, where you work, and then any asset that you may have as well. And these assets could be regulated assets like money, and different forms of money. If I get into the nuances, whether it's central bank money, commercial bank money, stable coins. It could be listed securities, publicly listed securities. It could be registered assets like physical property or a vehicle, anything that's registered with a registrar in any jurisdiction. It could be attested assets, and these are, think of it, assets that have third-party attestations, ratings, accreditations attached to them, like gold and silver and energy resources. Or it could be user-controlled assets like art or digital assets that are there. And so all of us have assets that encompass this entire spectrum. And the real idea is how do we shift that control back to each of us so that we can unlock the ability to transact with these assets anywhere, anytime, with whomsoever we want, within a legally compliant framework. And if you think about it, and we go back to a few years, let's say you and I were meeting in person, and I handed over a dollar bill to you. I could give that to you in real time, at the time we met. You could look at the dollar bill and verify it. It had all the marks to validate the bill, to watermark it, to know whether it's original or fraudulent, all self-described, self-contained, self-embedded within that one note. And then it's yours. That's it. You didn't have to talk to any other third-party system, validate it externally, integrate with APIs. It's yours. But when we integrated and digitized the financial systems and financial infrastructure over the last few decades, we lost some of that control, where now the asset sat in some ledger. For example, in my bank's ledger, it would be the validation logic, the fraud logic would sit in different systems, sanctions logic would sit in different systems. And now for us to do the same transaction, what would need to happen is my systems let's say I was storing that dollar with a bank,
Yeah.
my system, my bank system has to integrate with your bank system.
Mm.
And that's where the complexity arises. So now imagine for that same simple transaction, you are having to integrate these complex systems,
Mm.
which in certain cases did work out successfully. We
Yeah.
created purpose-specific card networks
Mm.
and cross-border networks to facilitate that. But
Mm.
moment you think of the broader set of asset classes, that doesn't exist.
Mm.
Property and so many other asset classes, or even within money, when you start thinking of lower value payments and so on.
Yeah.
And so, really, the idea about the Finternet is to bring that control back, given the newer technologies that are now coming up. If you look at the cryptographic technologies that are being developed, we can
Mm.
imagine we're sort of at the threshold within the financial system today, where
Mm.
you can now imagine a lot of these flows being done in a legally compliant way, but with the control resting with the individual. And that's extremely powerful
Mm.
because of the types of transactions and the types of economic value it would unlock. You can imagine the same for equity shares,
Yeah.
right? I
Yeah.
gave you, you gave me a share physically at any time of the day or night, and it's mine.
Mm.
But fast forward to today, and we can't transact at certain parts of the day because the markets are closed, right?
Yeah.
It just doesn't
Yeah.
make sense. And so again, what's happening is because of the newer technologies, you're allowed to imagine this possibility, which I think we couldn't have imagined even 5 years back for
True.
sure.
Mm.
This possibility of users having control over all their assets, identities, and credentials. So that's really the idea behind the Finternet.
Mm.
And it cuts across both individuals and businesses,
Yeah.
organizations as well.
Mm.
And just a bit of backstory, this was a paper that we published
Mm.
last year in Washington, D.C. This is something that was co-authored by Nandan Nilekani and Augustine Carstens. Nandan had co-founded Infosys and shaped a lot of the digital public infrastructure journey.
Yeah.
Augustine himself was prior to that the central bank governor in Mexico, finance minister, and currently the outgoing general manager of the BIS.
Mm.
And so it was the four of us, so along with Augustine Nandan and myself, Pramod Verma, who's been the chief
Yeah.
architect of Aadhaar and UPI and
Mm.
multiple billion people plus
Yeah.
systems, we spent quite a bit of time thinking through how this imagination would look like.
Yeah.
And that's really, I would say it's been a journey of about 4 or 5 years. And then
Mm.
over the last 2 years, it really got accelerated. The first conversation was what Pramod and I had maybe about, I think 4 years back on
Mhm.
this, 4 to 5 years back in
Yeah.
his backyard. I still remember. But it's one of those things where you have these ideas, you don't really take it up, it
True.
sits at the back of your mind.
Yeah.
And then in a meeting that we had with Augustine,
Yeah.
it just came out and there was this connection, and we felt let's explore this further. And that finally resulted in the paper being published in DC,
Mhm.
along with the central bank governors from, I think it was Germany, Brazil, and Korea.
Okay.
And since then, uh, it's been quite a journey. We'll dive into that.
Yeah.
But that's sort of a quick overview of what the Finternet is about.
Wonderful. So Siddharth, what I gather is it's not a very India specific, but it's a global journey that you see for Finternet, especially with the fact that with Augustine coming into the play, you guys discussing this, and the Bank of International Settlements, as per se, I would say, coming in. There's a lot of international focus. So how has been the journey in the last few months for you guys, the four of you?
Yeah, so what we felt is really when you look at this problem
Mm.
at the root, it's actually sector agnostic or country agnostic,
Mm.
right? So when you're thinking about unlocking verifiability, transactability of these assets,
Yeah.
these are properties and characteristics that
Mm.
are agnostic to sector, jurisdiction, country.
Mm.
And so the real question is, how do you layer on
Mm.
jurisdictional norms on top of
Yeah.
common universal infrastructure,
Mm.
right? So,
Mm.
an easy analogy to think about this is, let's say you have a smartphone. Now,
Mm.
on a smartphone, let's say we have Apple or
Yeah.
Android that we're discussing, iOS or Android. Anyone can deploy applications.
Mm.
So, except if I deploy an application that starts issuing currency, then I would have public authorities
Yeah.
question and come after me. But at the end of the day, anyone can deploy applications.
Mm.
And the central bank is not regulating the core operating system,
True.
right?
Yeah.
But in traditional financial infrastructure, because of the tech that's available, settlements, etc., you end up regulating the full stack,
Yeah.
which is now changing.
Mm.
And so we're moving into a paradigm where you have universal infrastructure being available, but
Mm.
you regulate the flows.
Mm.
And that's very key. So you continue to enforce jurisdictional norms on who are the issuers, who are the counterparties, what are the transaction limits, what are your capital controls. All of that can be embedded as part of the flow,
Yeah.
but you're not having to create purpose-specific infrastructure because the way it works today in the financial system, it's sort of like every time we build a new car, we build a new road,
Mm.
right? So you have
Yeah.
one settlement system for P2P, one for P2M, one for
Mm.
G2P, government
Yeah.
to person, then separate for securities.
Yeah.
And what we were asking was sort of a very first principles question of saying, what's really the differences and what are the commonalities, right? And in the technology world, this is not new. If
Mm.
you go back in time, early days of the internet, and we've been heavily inspired by the internet across the thinking of protocols
Yeah.
and networks and how do you unleash private innovation with a lot of these interventions at humanity scale. I mean, it's just phenomenal. There was no one coordinating body for the internet that made it happen, right? It just grew to billions of people participating in it and creating a whole new economy. So if you go back early days of the internet, you'd say you would have had like an IBM net or like a, enterprise net, and they would have provided the software, the
Yeah.
hardware, the client-side applications, the security and privacy controls. And there was a lot of reservation for people to bridge onto public networks. At that
Mm.
point, people would have been like, what do you mean I want my own private network?
Yeah.
But then moment you started to see the need for people to interconnect
Mm.
across the world, right?
Yeah.
You and I sitting in these two jurisdictions to talk to each other over Zoom. Moment these needs became more, then you had to bridge onto newer kinds of protocols. And so that's where you saw a convergence from some of these purpose-specific protocols towards IP protocols, the
Mm.
packet, the
Mm.
HTTP, www,
Yeah.
etc. of the world. And that's phenomenal because just imagine, you and I are talking over Zoom. All of this at the lowest level is represented as a packet,
True.
right?
Yeah.
So whether you're transferring money,
Yeah.
whether you're transferring securities, whether you're transferring this Zoom call, whether the viewers watch this later over one of the streaming channels, all of it at the most primitive level is represented as a
Yeah.
packet.
Yeah. Yeah.
And packets are
Absolutely.
designed to fail.
True.
So, the thinking where at the lower levels you had this openness, you
Mm.
had resilience being created through adoption and a bunch of other mechanisms. And then you started to create, different types of flows. And so if
Yeah.
money is flowing, packets could fail, but money obviously can't fail. You can't say it disappeared. You need provenance. And so you allowed for ways at a higher
Mm.
order to build those flows.
Mm.
And I feel like that's the convergence we're seeing within the financial system.
Mm.
This is the same thing with smartphones. You went from each one of us having a DSLR and a mic and
Yeah.
a sort of keyboard of our own, and each of these were not programmable, but that got
Yeah.
unified in a common programmable environment,
True.
unlocked new economies, which was the
Yeah.
whole mobile economy.
Mm.
And so our view is we are at a similar threshold within the
Mm.
financial system because the needs of people to transact, um, and this is not just cross-border, this is even within a country, the ability to use my assets in
Yeah.
my own advantage.
Mm.
As those needs increase, you're having to think about far more internet native
Mm.
infrastructure to support that, which in fact, in my view, strengthens compliance, strengthens a lot of the safeguards
Yeah.
that are required.
Yeah.
So that's really the essence behind the Finternet, and that's been its journey. So think of it as we call it the three U's.
Mhm.
One is first U is user centric. Give
Mm.
users control, give users agency of the identity credentials
Yeah.
assets. The second U is how do you unify?
Yeah.
So you have these diverse categories.
Mm.
How do you unify? So how do you ensure there's for each asset type,
Yeah.
the sovereignty, autonomy, all of that is followed
Mm.
by the corresponding authorities, but it's unified to the end user
Mm.
because that's what's most important. Otherwise, our assets are
Yeah.
spread out in different branches and
Yeah.
portals,
Mm.
documents, and we
Mm.
are having to somehow unify, which is impossible for most
Mm.
of us. And then the third U is universal
Mm.
infrastructure.
Yeah.
So our view is the only way this can be built is if you think about it as highly universal infrastructure, but flows that can be regulated and shaped on top. So that's really the essence behind the Finternet. And the journey since we published, to your question,
Yeah.
uh, over the last year has just been spent meeting public authorities across the world, private sector across the world, getting a lot of feedback
Yeah.
on where things are at, what makes sense, what's resonating, what doesn't resonate, what can we learn from. But it's really exciting because it's very clear to us that this is how the future is going to be over the next 10 to 15 years,
Yeah.
without a doubt. And we just love to play a small part in accelerating that journey for all of us.
Wonderful. So, what's the kind of feedback that we received? You say they're positive vibes, and which part of the world has this been addressed? That's my first question. And the second is in terms of an operational execution to the next level. Do you guys plan to have some offices worldwide? What's the plan, and how do you guys want to execute this in the next few months?
Yeah, so we at the end of the day are plumbers, so
Hmm.
we really get excited by the execution and operationalization, even though it's very challenging.
Yeah.
So what we are now doing is we're setting up a network of labs,
Hmm.
and we already have one Finternet lab that's set up in the US. We have one in India. We're soon going to have one in Singapore and one in Switzerland as part of the first phase.
Okay.
And in the second phase, we'd have a presence in Africa, the UK, and Latin America.
Hmm.
And the real idea is to now use the labs as a mechanism to work on different adoption pilots
Hmm.
and work on different technology infrastructure,
Hmm.
accelerate the technology infrastructure to bring the Finternet to life.
Okay.
So that's really where we are. We're moving really fast
Hmm.
and recruiting the best minds
Yeah.
across the world to contribute
Hmm.
towards this mission. So
Yeah.
also, if anyone's interested and listening to this podcast, please do reach out. But we've actually spent time with central banks, with
Yeah.
supervisory authorities, enforcement
Hmm.
agencies, a whole range, securities commissions, to just get feedback on what are the first principles. Are we thinking about it right? And then similarly with private sector, whether that's
Yeah.
asset managers, commercial banks, fintechs, crypto companies.
Hmm.
And there's a large community that's come together on the Finternet already,
Hmm.
that's been building different sandboxes,
Hmm.
different benchmarking efforts, different early pilots
Hmm.
across the board. So Finternet's sort of a broader umbrella.
Okay.
And the reason we've consciously designed it to be a broader umbrella,
Yeah.
which has, different crypto companies, different blockchains, etc.,
Yeah.
participating, is really because the broader mission is greater than all of us, right?
True.
And so if we can move towards unlocking those kinds of value,
Hmm.
that will be very powerful. And that's really where we are. So pretty much in the weeds of operationalizing this as we speak.
Wonderful. So, since this internet is going to be all about finance, transactions, loads of,
It's actually not just
reconciliations
about finance.
beyond that, goes beyond that.
It actually goes, it's Finternet's a catchy word, no
Yeah.
doubt. And one of the things is it also, however, makes it seem that it's primarily focused on finance,
Yeah.
but it actually goes beyond that because it talks about, for example, energy resources,
Okay.
right? As the world moves
Hmm.
towards much more decentralized energy
Yeah.
resources because of renewables, so
Hmm.
production is moving decentralized. How do you finance those?
Hmm.
So the actual tokenization of energy resources before they even get financed
Okay.
is a very key use case. Now, I may happen to get it financed, or I may happen to not get it financed. I may just use it as part of an audit process and
Hmm.
things like that.
Hmm.
So it starts cutting into many other sectors
Hmm.
that go beyond what we would traditionally think of finance.
Hmm.
But finance obviously plays a very key role to make these assets lendable,
Hmm.
investable,
Hmm.
insurable. So sort of a layer on top.
Hmm.
But unless you unlock the native verifiability of assets, not necessarily financial assets, but
Yeah.
many other types of assets that are out there, then it's even hard for the financial system to reach them.
True.
So it's sort of in that sense is much broader than
Just goes
a
beyond
typical
finance.
sort of
Yeah.
financial infrastructure.
Hmm. Okay. So what about areas which, when you build a system of a very different, and the scalability is a prime, focus. How about the compliance, the legal framework, the risk parameters, and the governance function around it? Are you guys also giving, an equal impetus to these things, because that's what matters at the end of the day in terms of the backbone of this system.
100%, 100%. I mean, if we look at it, um, a couple of thoughts. In
Mm.
fact, even in the paper, we have an entire section on fraud,
Yeah,
which references work that was done by FinCEN from the US.
yeah.
And it really categorizes what are the different types of fraud that are facing the financial system today,
Mm.
different types of identity fraud, authorized fraud, different types of circumvention attacks,
Yeah.
obfuscation attacks, etc. And our view is actually infrastructure like the Finternet
Mm.
allows you to imagine a far safer financial system for a couple of reasons.
Mm.
One, you can start to embed compliance within the flows of these transactions,
Mhm.
which is really difficult to do in the traditional financial system.
Yeah.
So you can embed the rules, embed who can issue, what are the counterparties, what are the transaction limits. At a very granular level, you have control in all these transaction flows.
Mm.
The second is you have observability. So participants in a transaction, not globally, but participants in a transaction,
Yeah.
have end-to-end verifiable observability of those flows, which
Mm.
today also you don't have in the traditional financial system, because in many cases it's CSV files that are reported.
Yeah.
And so I can just change the numbers in the CSV files.
Mm.
And that's in fact how fraud gets buried
Mm.
in the
Mm.
paperwork. And then you
Yeah.
discover it 3 months later, 6 months in audits. So the fact that you have native verifiable observability of your transaction flows is a very key characteristic,
Mm.
but limited to participants in the transaction. That's key.
Yeah.
The third is within the Internet paper, we have this idea of token managers. And what that basically means is while users have control over their assets, in many situations, users would actually need support in complying with regulations
Mm.
and other types of workflows, supporting
Mm.
workflows that an asset has, taxation, declaration, so on and so forth. And that's typically where custodians come in. And so token managers, which could be different types of entities, whether it's your bank, whether it's a property registrar, so on and so forth, actually play a critical role there. And they are also part of their function is
Mm.
enforcing compliance as part of that flow,
Mm.
right? So you get a lot of support from these kinds of actors, and that's a key part of our mental model, so that the
Mm.
user is not burdened with a lot of those rules.
Mm.
Although maybe over the next 10, 20 years, in like a post-AI world, you could have AI agents doing it, and some of these
Yeah.
activities may get unbundled for
Mm.
sure. But then also the liability in some of those questions can be taken on by the token managers. Another critical part, in addition to what I've shared, is now if you have universal infrastructure, you
Mm.
can actually deploy compliance tech applications, supervisory tech applications, regulatory tech applications on the flow, which is very powerful because today it's just very expensive. I mean, you have 100 countries that have a population less than 10 million.
Yeah.
And if you look at that, they don't have the ability to contract with high quality vendors because the vendors are, in many cases, there's no economy of scale. And even if you do it, you just sort of get siloed to one settlement system or one
Yeah.
transaction system. What happens to the rest, right? And that's also what fraudsters leverage,
Mm.
arbitrage between systems.
Yeah.
And so our view is what the Finternet does is really allows you to create this playground that allows for the deployment of a whole range of compliance tech, soup tech apps, regulatory tech apps that will then empower
Mm.
regulators slash public authorities in different countries, and that can
Yeah.
vary depending on jurisdiction to jurisdiction,
Mm.
to actually enforce a lot of the consumer protection requirements that are
Mm.
critical
Mm.
when you think of population scale developments and deployments. And
Yeah.
so, in my view, really an approach like the Finternet allows you to strengthen a lot of the compliance in the system. And
Mm.
basically, what you're doing, we've written about this in the paper, is this idea of layered proofing.
Mhm.
And all layered proofing means is depending on the risk of a transaction, you're layering on the proofs that you need, the proofs from the participants. And then that, along with the rest of what I mentioned, the
Yeah.
observability,
Mm.
the fact that you have verifiability, provenance, the fact that you can enforce rules natively as part of a transaction, and you can complement it with applications of the RegTech, SupTech, compliance tech kind, really allows you to imagine a far more robust way of thinking about this problem. So that's really how I look at it from a compliance standpoint. And of course, this will vary based on the asset, based on the jurisdiction, what sort of the dial or spectrum of this looks like.
Absolutely. In terms of, you mentioned, in terms of your plan, the short term, the vision that you have in the coming months to the, I guess it's quite a long term in the end of the day. How do you see the Finternet panning out in addition to those Finternet labs that are being set up across the locations, the jurisdictions?
Yeah, so really at this point, where we are at is focusing a lot on pilots of
Mm-hmm.
these concepts.
Mm-hmm.
Over the next few months, we should have about 10 pilots live, and we are keen to, again, if anyone's listening, I will be opportunistic because,
Of
we are like a
course.
small startup.
Yeah.
So I leverage every opportunity to either recruit or partner.
Yeah.
And we are soon launching about 10 pilots,
Mm-hmm.
and we'll be doing a Finternet Summit in New York early next year, so people can watch out for that,
Mm-hmm.
where we'll showcase a lot of these pilots across different sectors, capital
Yeah.
market,
Yeah.
energy, so on
Mm-hmm.
and so forth. And that's really where we are at. So, testing out a lot of the primitives of what we think needs to work at scale, and then test those primitives in a sandboxed environment.
Yeah.
And that's really what the main focus is within the lab.
You mentioned about resourcing, and I'm sure skill set is something which is very key. How do people, I mean, are you guys reaching out to universities? Are you guys reaching out to tech institutions? How does one reach out to you? Maybe that's the better way to put it.
Yeah, so my email is can be shared as part of the
Yeah,
podcast, and
sure.
they can reach out over that, or Twitter primarily, X as it's now called. I've still not made the shift fully, but other than that, we do work with the universities.
Mm,
There are tracks that we've had with Stanford, with Oxford, with a range of other universities as well, and that is active. And we heavily work a lot with industry as well.
yeah.
So it's sort of a mix.
Mm,
Really, the intent being bringing together the right set of people that can help us think about these problems and then actually start building out infrastructure to execute on them.
wonderful. I now want to talk to you about the India stack, and you've been very instrumental from UPI to Ayushman Bharat to DigiYatra and even the Digital Sky. I believe, and I'm very sure right now, the world talks about it when you meet them in across the globe, right? India has been there, right? And I'm sure we've leapfrogged, I mean, probably 40, 50 years ahead, right? What's been the feedback to you on the India stack story? And maybe you could just take us through the challenges in those years when you guys were working on these, these projects, if I may say so. And now you see the outcomes, right? Like literally, we always say that we want to make it like, democratized or really user friendly. And there you see, literally on every man on the street is using UPI for that matter, or DigiYatra when you fly across crisscross airports. What's been the feedback, and what's been the underlying challenges for you?
Yeah, so I think if we look at the learnings from the India stack, but also the broader
Yeah.
digital public infrastructure that's been developed, and I've been very grateful to have been a part of that journey. And most of my contributions, particularly focused on developing the account aggregator ecosystem and some of the other things that you
Mm,
mentioned, I think is in a couple of areas. One is it really showed me the power of if you give individuals agency, if you return that back to them, um, the amount of opportunity it unlocks is just phenomenal. So think about Aadhaar, which is the identity system that rolled out to 1.4 billion people.
mm,
All it did is it just gave you a attestation, a digital attestation, a digital file that said you are who you claim to be, and you could use that digital file in any digital system that you transacted with, whether that was a bank or whether that was at the airport or a telecom company or in the capital markets and so on and so forth. Just that, right? Now, when you look at that, just the simple fact that one gave them those proofs, those attestations, allowed individuals to now, for example, open up bank accounts, and you had 500 million accounts opened. And that accelerated the developmental journey of a country like India, where you went from what 2008 would have traditionally taken us about 50 years, 5 decades to get to where we did in less than a decade, right? So you shaved off 4 decades of developmental growth, compressed that and delivered that in less
Yeah.
than a decade, which is phenomenal because then you could start thinking about other types of capital formation. Otherwise, we would have to wait for half a century to then even think of the next steps. So that was the power. Similarly, individuals then, once they were enabled on a fast payment system like UPI, you went from in 2016 about 20 to 30 million cardholders to today about 500 million people doing digital payments. You went from 5 million merchants in 2016 to 50 million official merchants today. Unofficially, it'll probably be about 100 million because a lot of
Yeah.
smaller merchants act as
True.
individuals on the other end. So that's a dramatic expansion of the market. Similarly, if you look at account aggregator, which is the data sharing infrastructure,
Yeah.
once you've transacted, you need to be empowered with control over your data. And you look at that system, it went from, almost no accounts being enabled to today about 2 billion financial accounts live on the system and about 150 million people that have used it. And it's still in its early days,
True.
but there are about 600 financial institutions that are part of that network today. And so what you're seeing is bit by bit, as you give people control back of their identity, control over their money, control over their data, and similarly, it could be also health data, et cetera, et cetera. It unlocked a lot of economic value for them as well as for broader society around that, private sector, and so on.
Yeah.
And that's extremely inspiring because you have to also design that in a highly heterogeneous environment, highly diverse environment. And so there were a lot of, I would say, muscles that got built around how do you think about private innovation? How do you think about encouraging more diversity, not making everything uniform?
Yeah.
How do you think about creating the right seeds so that it evolves over a period of time? Because a lot of these projects have a 5, 10 year rollout period in many cases for them to hit scale. So a lot of that thinking and muscles are also what we started to reflect on when we were imagining the Finternet. But obviously, when you're dealing with different countries, different jurisdictions,
Yeah.
their needs vary as well, right? And some of it, for example, along the journey, we spend time building an open source version of Aadhaar, which today has about, I think it's live in over 10 plus countries. There are about 130 million or 150 million people that have been issued digital IDs using that open source space called Mozip. And so there were a lot of efforts of applying this in other countries, applying this in a cross-border context as well.
Yeah.
Um, but often that also took a lot of time, right? Most cross-border connections often take like 5 years. Now imagine 190 countries into 190 countries into 5 years. It is really long. And so what we felt is, again, going back to the internet and what's often been our driving inspiration is how do you create humanity scale infrastructure? So you can allow for regions or sectors because it's the same problem. Even if you think about it within a country, you will deal with the different sectors. If you think about it across countries, you're just dealing with different jurisdictional boundaries. So as a pattern, it's very much similar types of
Yeah.
problems. And so what we really felt is that we needed a much more general purpose sort of humanity level approach towards how we think about this infrastructure. And much like what the internet did with packets and all of those standards protocols and eventually runtime infrastructure that was created. Because within the lab, we're not just creating a set of protocols, but we'll actually be creating a whole range of infrastructure and operating models as well. So sort of the full stack in close collaboration with community members. But a lot of those key ideas of the power of giving that control back, in my view, is very inspiring. And that dramatically, of course, impacted India even at a macro level.
Yeah.
And we see it today. You've gone from relatively less retail investor participation in our capital markets to today. I think it's what still at 10% probably, if I'm getting my numbers correct. But every month you have $3 billion that are coming in through SIP, which is a structured investment products, and that's happening because of UPI and e-mandates, which are nothing but a subscription way to deduct money and transfer it on
True.
a recurring basis.
Yeah.
And that's had a macro impact because as you have foreign investor flows and outflows, which increases market volatility
Yeah.
because of UPI and hence because of retail investors, you at least have some bit of flow that's coming
Mm.
in every month,
Yeah.
which is very powerful, right? So now I don't think any of us could have imagined these are the types of macro impacts that get created when you have simple interventions like this kind of infrastructure. But I feel all of it just comes down to the broader idea of give people agency, give people control, and
Mm.
let them shape what are the opportunities they want to access in
Mm.
their own life. And if you can do that, if you can create infrastructure that facilitates that,
Yeah.
then you leave the rest to markets, you leave the rest to public sector to actually drive and shape how that goes on to be adopted.
Yeah.
But generally, that ends up uplifting society as a whole.
So you've worked with some top-notch super brains like Nandan Nilekani and also Pramod Verma and teams like them, right? Behind the scenes, what's it working with them? Maybe you can share your personal experiences.
Yeah, I've been very, very grateful, and I've had the privilege to work with both Nandan and Pramod now for almost a decade.
Yeah.
When I started working with them, I must have been around 19. That's really when
How,
the
how,
journey
how
started.
who found who?
It,
How was that?
it
What's
was
the story?
it,
Yeah.
it was very, very early days. So in fact, I the way it happened was I'd started a company when I was 17, which was a crowdfunding company. So I think I got a bit frustrated with the traditional academic system
Yeah.
and created that startup. It was sort of a basic platform to raise ideas, to raise funds for ideas, projects,
Mm.
causes, and the like. And interestingly, I still remember when we built that, it took us almost like I think 6 months because you had to get a payment gateway integration and then payment gateway for international payments. You needed that integration. And I remember recently, it was at one of the conferences. I met this guy. He had dropped out. He was from Kashmir. He dropped out of high school. And he had also built a crowdfunding company on newer rails, so the
Mhm.
public blockchains and the like.
Yeah.
He built it in like weeks. And that's when I realized the ground has fundamentally
Yeah.
shifted.
Yeah.
Now, of course, there are ways you strengthen transactions on public chains and, bring in safety compliance, etc. But at the lowest level, we've just changed the infrastructure to imagine and build and accelerate has just shifted before our very own eyes. But anyways, at that point, a lot of this didn't exist.
Yeah.
So I started off this crowdfunding platform, worked on it for 2 years, closed it down, and then was figuring out what else to do with my life. Felt a bit
Mm.
existential, as one would during those periods. And then I ended up moving to Bangalore. So in between, I did this hackathon, and at the hackathon, one of the sponsors who actually rejected me at the hackathon ended up recruiting me.
Okay.
And so that's how I ended up moving to Bangalore. And then it was from Bangalore that I ended up becoming a part of the community that Nandan and Pramod and others had incubated.
Mhm.
And that's when I started working on, this was early days of UPI, and that's when I started working on the whole account aggregator framework and architecting that. But it's been a tremendous privilege. I mean, both of them are just phenomenal individuals to
Yeah.
work with.
Mm.
Um, and I would say just a couple of things. I think one is just the ability to think that long term,
Mm.
to imagine what a decade-long impact and change would look like, but start acting in the now, is very powerful without being caught up in all the constraints of the now, right? So because many a times when you operate in the now, you're also like, this doesn't exist, this regulation's not there, this infrastructure is cost, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
But how do you sort of stay anchored on where you need to be, and then build an ecosystem, build a support system of, broader society to move in that direction, but act very much, we're not sitting here and just waiting, act very much with what you have in the now. I think that's been very powerful,
Mm.
but just unconstrained, right? Your thinking is not
Yeah.
constrained. It's only constrained by yourself, and that's
Yeah.
often what I feel. It's like, my imagination is the only constraint, and that's a great environment to be in because it just pushes you to be so much better.
Yeah. Mm. Mm.
I
Mm.
feel the second thing has also been just their pace of learning and unlearning, the humility to always be like the openness,
Mm,
right? The openness to a whole range of ideas. Many a times, some of these ideas might be contradictory to efforts they have done or mental models they may have thought about, and the willingness to just engage.
mm,
And then, as long as, let's say, I have conviction in some of these ideas, support that. And then eventually, in some cases, these ideas might change even mental models that they may
mm.
have, and vice versa, right?
Yeah.
They may have ideas and I change my mental models. But I think just creating an environment where it's Nandan often calls it a trial by fire, right?
Mm,
So you just put in the best ideas. You get anyone, doesn't matter age, gender, where you're from, etc. But you just trial these ideas by fire, and let the best ones emerge from that, is extremely critical. Because we don't realize about the biases we have to even think about ideas,
yeah.
and explore different ideas. But especially when you're creating and you're building these kinds of infrastructure, you need a much higher degree of openness, than if you were just building one sort of app for
Yeah.
a smaller section of society. So I feel just that, and then third is just their energy. I mean, it's really fun. It's been 10 years, and every interaction is just so positive, and you just feel even more hopeful of the future, and you feel like, okay, let's do this. And we keep raising the bar in terms of the types of challenges we take on. For example, the challenge is, how do you build infrastructure for 8 billion people? We've
Yeah.
gone from building for 1.4 billion. How do you build for 8 billion? And so much is so new. I mean, like every day we have conversations of, these are the things we actually have to, unlearn, because these are mental models that are not going to work for the challenge that's in front of us. And these are newer mental models we need. So I feel like just that environment of openness, um, trialing ideas by fire, of just constantly being able to reinvent,
Mm,
is extremely powerful, right? Reinvent yourself. I think that's another, if you look at even Nandan's journey, I mean, phenomenal, from building Infosys, which laid the foundation of much of the digital economy in India, to then going on to, in some sense, at a political level, chair the Aadhaar program, which is a
yeah.
whole other thing dealing with
Altogether.
governance,
Absolutely.
central,
Yeah.
state, and then going on to also create UPI and a whole range of other infrastructure. And so just the need, even Pramod, going from a startup in Boston to the Aadhaar project, to UPI, to DigiLocker, to, I mean, like multiple billion
Yeah.
people plus systems. And in my view, probably outside of the work that's happened in the US with big tech, or in China, the ecosystem in India is really the third ecosystem that's been creating a billion people plus platforms and systems. And so to be a part of that, has just been a tremendous learning
Can
journey,
imagine.
and it's just so exciting and so gratifying.
Absolutely. You've been crisscrossing the world, but end of the day, you're a very original Goa boy. Uh, do you get time to be in Goa, or is it just what, or is that again a holiday destination for you?
It's not as much. I mean, it's always hard trying to figure out questions when it's like, where are you from? Are you a
Yeah.
Goa boy or not? I feel, because I was born in Bombay, and spent a few years in Bombay, but then my parents shifted over to Goa, and that's how I moved, and spent most of my life in Goa.
Hmm.
So from that standpoint, yes, very much a Goa boy. I think when you grow up in Goa, yeah, it's sort of a very different experience than if you were a tourist to Goa. Um, but I think I felt really bored growing up, to be honest,
Okay.
because especially at that time, there wasn't a lot to do.
Hmm.
You're sort of in this small coastal town,
Yeah.
and especially if you're interested in tech, again, there's not a lot that was happening. But I feel, looking back, it definitely was a fun environment to grow up in, because
Hmm.
just the sheer exposure to the natural world around
Yeah.
you, to the ocean,
Yeah.
a lot of the openness it created, because you're always meeting some of the most diverse people,
Yeah.
across the world, who would often land up slash transit through Goa
Hmm.
at different stages of their life. And so you're often meeting that versus a lot of, let's say, traditional Indian cities.
Yeah.
So I feel like, looking back, it seemed like a fun journey. But when I was in it, it's one of those things where just like, and
Yeah.
I had a lot of cousins who would be based in Bombay, Bangalore, and I would always be wishing that I was there. but I feel like yeah, it was good fun. I don't get
But
to
you
spend a
did
lot.
try, you did try scuba diving and
Oh yeah,
windsurfing.
yeah, yeah.
Nice.
I had to find something to do with the
Yeah.
the time that I had. So I did end up doing a bunch of scuba diving and windsurfing, and then that moved on to kite surfing. So that's just fun. I just love
Yeah.
being. I mean, the ocean's phenomenal, and I love being in the water. So
Yeah.
when I do get time, I try to do some of those activities
Okay.
while I travel.
Okay.
But it's not been as much
And what's
as
a day off like for you? If there is one, how do you spend time?
I genuinely love what I do. So it's really
Anyway, taking care of it.
it's not like there's a particular day that's off per se.
Yeah.
I really love what I do, and the way I look at it is if I do, however, need time to rest and recover, I do focus on giving myself that, and whether that's time with family, whether that's time by myself. Um, and I just sort of calibrate to that, but it's
Yeah.
not like, I need these X days off or I need this X vacation or whatever. I think it's how do you build rest and recovery into your schedule,
Yeah.
into your daily schedule as well, and into those smaller moments, so that you can sort of play these longer term games without burning out. That's very key. Um, I don't think I'm like perfect at that or like great at that, but that's definitely the intent of what I've been trying to do over the last few years at least.
Absolutely. Siddharth Shetty, co-creator, Finternet. All the very, very best to you and this project, Finternet, to you and your team. And you guys are, again, leapfrogging India now on a world level. So that's really interesting. And I'm sure it's exciting. All the very best to you. And of course, I think such a huge contribution by you, Mr. Nilikani, and of course, Mr. Pramod Verma to the India stack. I think that itself is amazing. All the very best.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot, Santosh, for hosting me again. It was a really fun conversation,
Thanks.
and I appreciate. I know it's like probably near midnight where you're at, and so I'm glad I kept you up and then put you to sleep.
Just like you said, I
Uh,
love doing this at any given point in time. So it's
I can
exciting.
really feel that energy. So
Sure.
thank you so much again.
Yeah.
Take
And
care.
well, that's our thank you so much. And that's our first guest of season 3. Looking forward to an amazing guest series lineup on the Sound of Money season 3. From me, Santosh Sirur, and my guest, Siddharth Shetty. Thank you for watching The Sound of Money. Bye bye and take care.
The Sound of Money with Santosh Sirur.